Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Rise, Evolve Tech series, where we focus on the evolution of technology.
Things have changed, yet we evolve and adapt. But what's next, and what's next for you? Evolve focuses on the intersection of leadership, technology, and workplace. Don't get left behind. Join us in this evolution. Rise and evolve with us.
I'm Kim Ford, your host, and I have a very special guest with us today. Paul, can you take a minute to introduce yourself and your company?
Well, first off, Kim, thank you very much for the invitation for a conversation with you. First and foremost, as well to your audience. So my name is Paul Ruppert, and I've been in the telecommunications business for a little over 20 years. I dare say that. I helped launch one of the first, what's called GSM radio networks in North America. Everyone knows that today as AT&T Wireless. And I've been in this space specifically in focusing on mobile services on a global basis since that period. And during that time, I've helped startups go from startup to phenomenally successful endeavors. In one case where I was the 12th employee in the company, and 5 years later, we sold it for a little under $500 million. And I've also been involved in other large enterprises, one owned by the Carlyle Group, which is one of the largest private equity firms in the world. Many people have heard of that PE firm before, as well as consulted back to enterprises on how they can better utilize various types of communications platforms to better communicate with their consumers or customers. And many of us use the one that I'm focused on, which is text messaging, including I've got 2 patents that allow for interoperability of text messaging. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. And all those things I did on a global basis. I've flown a little over 2.5 million air miles in the course of my career. And as my wife always points out to me, I've visited over 70 countries during that period, mostly as to where are you going next? One of those discussions.
Exactly. That sounds like a lot of travel. I remember the days when travel was cool, and I used to have like the
Yeah.
bag tags, and now it's like you hide the bag tags. I don't even think they send them, do they?
Well, I haven't done much traveling in the last 3 years. I'm just like everybody else. So, yeah, the airlines, just this, we digress, but the reality is like they made sure that their premier diamond or global services customers with United, which is what I was, maintain their status even though we didn't get on and do
That's
flight
great.
one,
That's
during the course
wonderful.
of the pandemic. So.
Yeah. Well, I would love to start our conversation and talk about CPaaS and talk, if you could first explain what it is, and then second,
Sure.
can you talk about the impact it has on text communications?
Yeah, so CPaaS is an acronym that stands for Communications Platforms as a Service. So the as a service is very much like software, which is a business model, meaning software as a service. We hear this term bandied about often in the tech world as SaaS. So the business model is taking a software as a service solution, but marrying it with communications platforms of various types. And what are those types? Well, you have the obvious thing, which is voice, but also most importantly, text messaging, as well as what is called over-the-top messaging that's provided by the various applications that many people utilize, such as WhatsApp or WeChat or Kakao or Line or Viber. I mean, there's a very long list. Each one of those is similar to the other, but really different because they're all kind of semi-proprietary and offered by these various service providers. And then you also look into or also tap into app push type messages, which is text messaging driven by a specific app that you load onto your handset, your smartphone, as well as legacy solutions such as email. And then now more emerging are things like what we're doing, especially post-pandemic, which is video. And as you can see, there is a platform basis to all of these, an architecture that all of this is all combined together. And the last piece is artificial intelligence and chatbot functionality. So those are the various types of modalities of communication that we're all engaged in on a day-to-day basis. And someone decided to create this term of art. There's no science behind any of it, but it's a term of art describing this type of multifunctionality where an entity, a vendor who's in the space, like the companies that I've worked with, can come forward to, let's say, an American Express or Macy's or a host of any other type of large enterprise, Wells Fargo, et cetera, then say, we have a solution for you that all you need to really do is plug into us, and we'll be able to incorporate all these various types of application platforms for your benefit, whether you are looking to engage the consumer itself, or alternatively, the other alternative is looking at enterprises and how they manage their own internal communications. And that's a variation, to use another acronym, called UCaaS, which stands for Unified Communications as a Service. The difference is the focus, but the platforms are essentially the same. So I'm not sure I made that clear,
You did
but that's all the different facets to what CPaaS is all about.
Well, I think everybody knows what the cloud is, right? And everybody typically refers to the cloud as where data can go and data can live. Tell me about cloud communications and what is that?
Well, the reality is that in the old days, for example, when I first got into the telecommunications business, even though we were wireless, what we would call over here in the United States cellular, or what they would call offshore, meaning everywhere else around the world, as mobile, there was the last connection was between you, your handset, and the radio tower in a cell, hence the term cellular message or cellular telephones. But once it hit that, it hit a trunk, and the old days there were literally physical switches and connections and circuits that allowed a conversation to occur, even though it was a voice conversation. But then we got into the internet age, which was the same time that I entered the telecommunications business. And the internet is essentially the cloud. And then we started using technology called packet technology, where streams of data were literally like put into a little envelope and thrown up into the sky, into the cloud, and sent off to whatever the destination might be. And this was all in real time, practically. We're talking about lags of milliseconds, and then reconstituted. And then you would hear my voice on the other side of our connection. So that's essentially communications in the cloud as it's described.
Yeah. And what impact do you envision it having in the future? I mean, do you think this is a game changer? I mean, I remember when I started my career, the Telecom Act was passed, and I opened CLECs across the country.
There you go.
Fiber,
Exactly.
and they were very difficult at the time to find, right? Because fiber wasn't really readily available. So I was tracing dark fiber and trying to find buildings that actually could handle the floor load capacity for the battery backups. And
there we go.
It was a challenge.
Yeah, you've got deep knowledge on this. Maybe I should be listening to you explain it.
No, I mean, it's so funny you're speaking. I understand a lot of it. I think I opened probably 40 of these locations around the country.
Right.
So I got very well.
Well, the reality was that there was an oversupply occurred. And therefore, there was this moment in time where everything kind of got frozen, that the applications and all the solutions that were the back end of it, not just the architecture, but now we have to talk about what are the commercial opportunities that can be harvested or leveraged by utilizing this technology. That cut up, and then a boom exploded, which was in the 2000s. So game changer, I would say, yeah, the game changer was back then. Now we're really kind of into evolutionary changes, not necessarily revolutionary changes or massive innovation disruption, if you will. And that even in the context of CPaaS, I could go through a whole host of different companies that are in the quote CPaaS space, but they've been around for 20 years. But CPaaS, again, this term of art has only been around for 3 or 5 years. So what were they in the beginning, those first 15 years, if you will? Well, they were called messaging aggregators. And what were the messaging that they were aggregating? Well, they were going to enterprises and saying, hey, United Airlines, here's a solution that we can offer you that you can offer your consumers, and it's applications almost a plug and play. And they're like, well, how do you deliver the messages? Well, we use our partners, which are Vodafone or Verizon or T-Mobile US or US Cellular or Saskatchewan or China Telecom or whoever it might be. And we have these relationships with these mobile network operators, carriers, however you want to characterize them, all around the world. So we're going to sell our connectivity, we're going to sell our network, and you're going to be able to benefit from network by having that connection with us. How's that for an idea? And that prompted another group of evolutionary changes where the companies, there were, let's say marketing companies or in marketing agencies where people were like, wow, this text messaging thing, we should get on board. How could we do this? Maybe we should go to our customers now and say, do you need this? And those customers are like, well, this sounds pretty cool. Yeah, we could use this, but they don't know how it works. So what do? They then go, all right, I've got 20 customers who are going to push 20,000 messages a month through a network. Now they go to knocking on a door like Verizon or the companies that I worked with, which were the intermediaries, the middlemen in all of this. And we said, yeah, we can leverage our network by selling you access to the network. We're going to pay the network operators for that benefit, and you're going to be able to take advantage of it. And so this new evolutionary change created the species of aggregators, messaging aggregators. And over time, because of the newer technologies, et cetera, the aggregators realized, wow, this whole application capability, we should get involved in this, or maybe we should buy companies that are doing application development who might be looking at just the insurance company or just to the airline companies or just banking. And that's how all of this has kind of been promulgated and evolved over those 2 decades.
Oh, that's great. Can you tell us a little bit about your patents?
My patents. Wow, this is like, I've never really been inquired about my patents. Well, if I am self-described ambidextrous executive. What does that mean? Well, before I got into the private sector, I spent 12 years in the world of politics and have a graduate degree, in public administration. And you would be wondering, how did you get from that to this, just describing all this stuff in telecommunications? And I made that right turn and I was able to get into the space. But I've always been very curious as about the technical capabilities. More importantly, how do they marry up with other solutions to be more effective in a commercial context? Meaning, how are we going to make money on this? What's the business model? And as a result of being inside the startup that I mentioned, originally it was called InfoMatch, and when we sold it, it was called Mobile 365. We were constantly looking at intellectual property rights because that would essentially escalate our overall value of the company. That just wasn't driving additional revenues, it was driving new technology. And the company evolved as a result of new technology because the 3 guys who were the founders, they essentially said, we can use IP, Internet Protocol-based technology, and plug it into the switch systems of GSM services, which had that 160-character native capability, meaning it was built into the system. Nobody ever thought there was going to be these 160-character messages flowing around the world. But it did, and once it started taking off, other elements of this, evolved, as I said. The green shoots, if you will, sprouted up with different people looking at it different ways. So adjacently, they moved in, and I joined this startup after a venture capitalist that I know was like, I think this company should be focusing more on the foreign offerings to be able to access the U.S. market than the U.S. market, because after all, the U.S. market at the time was only about 20% GSM based. The other 80% was distributed or across a number of different radio interfaces, as they're called. And as a result of that, one day I was in a meeting with 2 other guys, and we're like, we should be able to take advantage of this interoperability between ANSI, which is the European standard, the North American standard, and the GSM standard, which was European originally, but then promulgated around the world on purpose because it was called Global System Mobile. And so we came up with this couple of ideas and realized we could probably patent this. Let's see if we can. and we had a resource in the company that was dedicated to how do we harvest and how do we create and harvest patents. And when we sold the company, we had about 35 under our belt. So, and I was just, became a co-author on one of them along the way, because it was an idea that myself and one other guy over lunch one day were talking about this idea, and that's when our masters were like, yeah, write it up. Let's see if we can submit this, and we did.
How do you keep your finger on the pulse of what's next for tech? I mean, how do you keep up with it?
I've in the past, I wrote a blog in the past, like 15 years ago. I wrote a blog for a little while. I found that it was too much heavy lifting to be able to do on the day-to-day basis that it was required. But one of the things I came up with was this notion, as I call it, innovisioneering. And innovisioneering is essentially, obviously, innovation and orienteering and engineering all combined, and orienteering is you're always looking at where you need to be going based on the stars or based on magnetic, your compass, etc. And you have to have a certain perspective that you're always open to things that might be a little bit different. So there's some cognitive dissonance in terms of being able to manage that and understand it, because you're willing to try something different. Some people are too rigid thinkers to think, yeah, we should go off and do this. And, there's a great book by Clayton Christensen, which is The Innovator's Dilemma. And he essentially breaks down the system as to why some companies are highly innovative and others are not, because they're too focused on the performance engine, his term, meaning just making sure everything's operating most efficiently. Those aren't usually the ones who are creating something new that's really disruptive that becomes a big impact. So I tend to focus obviously on the telecommunication space, and even more focus relative to the messaging space that I've been involved in. But there are certain trends that you start to recognize along the way. One of them is right now is I'm looking at quantum computing of all things, which sounds really complicated. It's based on quantum mechanics. I took a semester of physics in college and never came up with quantum mechanics. But the point there is this tool that can be applied to specific business and commercial exercises, and therefore it can become a product or could lead to an enterprise actually pursuing this. So that's that's how I look at these things. Always very, very open-minded.
Yeah, for sure. What tech do you think will become commonplace in the next couple of years?
Well, if I was that good of an analyst, I'd be working for Goldman Sachs.
Yeah, what are your thoughts? I mean, obviously you're on the telecommunication side. Everybody's talking about, is it Chat GPT? Is a big
deal. That's an artificial intelligence solution, and artificial intelligence, as I understand, has been around since 1956. I've even got a friend who's got a degree in artificial intelligence, and yet he's 52 years old. So, if it was really all that hot, well, he was getting that degree in the early 80s. And
what's amazing, that's how long it takes to become commonplace. And that's what's
right.
Interesting.
Exactly.
That's what's unique, is that it's all about timing, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people think of YouTube and think of their pitch deck when they pitched it. I mean, their pitch deck was very simple, black and white, straightforward, but they did come up with a solution that was incredibly needed. And it was the right time that it could be implemented. And I think that's that whole timing of the commonplace of something, right?
Yeah, and there's no question it's got to have a connection with, if it's a consumer-driven product, it's going to have a very wide, broad distribution and acceptance, adaptability as well to these various types of tastes. When you talk about communications, well, the reality is I am a trailing boomer. I have no qualms about having telephone calls with real live people. Okay, that's been the most of my adulthood. All right. Yeah. However, I've also lived through the phenomenon where, it was irregular for somebody to be sending more than 20 text messages a day. Well, in the Philippines, which is the most text-dense nation on earth, people do on average over 1,000 text messages a day. Many times just one word's going back and forth. And so to think that your mentality and your vision of today is going to be the same mentality and vision of tomorrow, that's not going to work. You can get it on the margins where you start seeing, hey, this is kind of interesting. Back to my innovisioneering comment, I always looked at, if I found an idea interesting, I would try to file it away. If it was interesting and then all of a sudden I saw it a second time, that's when I was like, the bells went off. If I saw it a third time, I knew that it's too late. It's already broken out. Even in regards to text messaging, people initially, companies, I should say, mobile network operators were thinking, okay, this is going to be ideal for the corporate road warrior who's going to be on the phone all the time, and it's going to be really how we want to position the company. Well, if you look at the heritage of text messages, it was really driven by teenage girls and adolescent girls, and it was not in the US. It was primarily first in Asia, and then migrated to Europe and Scandinavia, and then eventually it came around to the US. And that we're talking about a period from around 1995 to around 2005 in that 10-year period. And that's the nature of the platform and how it's evolved. The last step in all of this, now there is an entire cohort, an entire generation who's lived and was raised on utilizing text messaging. And those millennials are less willing to have a telephone call than they would prefer to have a text message. And that has shifted everything from customer care engagement and the customer care business, how they're looking at it in terms of what's called conversational commerce. Well, guess what? It's much more effective to be sending text messages, because if we were making telephone calls, it goes into a call center. And most call centers have 100% turnover of employees in 90 days. And that's because there's so much pressure. Answer the phone, answer the problem, do it fast. The money, even I sat, believe it, when I first came into the telecoms business, they had me sit on a call center inside the business for about a week, and it was mostly about just observing and seeing what was going on. And it's a high stress environment to be able to answer those questions, whether it's a building question or a technology question. Well, now with text messaging, you can do this what's called asynchronously. So at 2:00 in the morning, I could send my carrier a question about a solution or a problem that I'm having, whether it's my bill or technology issue. That goes into the queue. That's dealt with on a time basis, not that it has to be done immediately, but done within a certain time window. And when they get up, maybe it's 7 in the morning, that's been resolved. And
they tee up all the queues, right?
That's right. And so that is a breaking scenario in the business. So along the way, I saw an analyst report. It's called mobilesquare.co.uk, who just looks at the messaging business, and they shifted into customer care. And this is a few years ago. It showed that there are over 20 trillion voice minutes dedicated to customer care annually on a global basis. 20 million minutes. All right. So that's 20 trillion minutes, I should say. So what the reality is now that the telecom space, the CPaaS space, is recognizing as, well, if we got 10% of that business, okay, that's 200 billion messages or 200 billion minutes that could be shifted into just messaging. What a huge opportunity that we could pursue. That would probably be maybe a couple % of the total messages sent on a global basis on an annually. So there are ripple effects that start to occur as a result of what seems like, oh, this is really kind of a change in technology from voice to text. There are huge ripple effects that come in afterwards.
What's really frustrating for me is how many bots are out there that aren't real people whatsoever. And then they try to make them intelligent, right? So they're using some type of tree of machine learning, so that the consumer really is duped for a long time. And I would guess that older people really think they're talking. I keep warning my mom, who every day spends about 4 to 5 hours in her VR headset. This is what she does.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So she's like one of those ladies that she's about 80 and she lives on virtual reality. All of her friends are riding bikes with her in Austria and you name it. And she tells
Oh,
me about
wow.
her friends. And I joke back
Okay.
and I'm like, Mom, I bet that's not even like their real name. And she's like, yes, it is. I know Susie that well. And, but it's so
Yeah.
funny. She's the same person that, thinks she's having a conversation with her bank and
Yeah.
it's a bot. And so that's a little bit frustrating from, the texting perspective too, because I think a lot of that is automated.
Yeah. The reality of the telecommunications business, again, from tapping into my own background, my deep background a long time ago in the public space, in the telecommunications arena, there are policies that are being implemented by various states around the country, as well as countries around the world, where there has to be a notification to the consumer that a human is either available or will be engaged, and it's the term of all things is called tango in and tangoing out.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so a human being can enter the conversation if there comes a break point that the bot is not suitably developed to be able to answer your
But
question.
that should be disclosed that you're talking to a bot.
Absolutely.
There's
Yeah,
a huge
exactly.
issue right now where older people are being taken advantage of. I pretty much know
Sure.
if it's a bot because I phrase the question the
Yeah.
right way to begin with, and you immediately know.
Yeah.
But it's frustrating, and I feel bad for people that don't realize they're just wasting their time.
Yeah, that's the security piece. And I mean, speaking candidly, I have fallen into recently a phishing scam that I didn't realize. I mean, and the worst part about it was I was involved in a solution 5 years ago where we got this award where we were able to break it down with another company that we did an alliance with. And I thought to myself, man, this is just what we used to identify. It looked like a company that was valid, that I was waiting a communication with, that was presenting it as a message. And then when I realized I started giving them my credit card information for a 30-cent purchase, that's when the light bulb went off.
Wow,
Okay.
you came close.
Yeah, very close. But for a very small fee. And I didn't give him a PIN number or anything like that, but I was authorizing a 30-cent. But if you do, millions of these things, you could start really racking up some big fraud, some felony-like fraud.
Sure.
But the point was, man, I got that far, that deep, and I should, I'm viewed as an expert in cybersecurity in the mobile space. Yeah. And I was like, wow, and once I looked at it, I recognized my mind just focused on one thing, that the alarm went off, which was one change in an email address. Yep. Meaning, it was a vowel instead of a consonant, or a consonant instead of a vowel. Yeah. And once I found it, first thing I called T-Mobile, second thing I called the bank, T-Mobile for, hey, you need to be, I don't want to push this into mark as junk, because once that happened, that goes into a completely dark, database. Yep. So I was just telling this guy on the phone as to, look, this is what I do for a living. I know what you guys are doing. You need to be able to put this on the list. This is really, and it was a fraudulent depiction of the U.S. Postal Service, but it was so damn good. Yeah,
they almost had you. So we have a bunch of clients right now planning an office relocation, and one of the questions they ask us is about telecommunications. And believe it or not, we have some clients that actually have still old school plug-in phones. We have some on voice over IP, and we have some that don't ask that question because they've just gone to their cell phone. So we actually just use one phone, our cell phones. And the reason why is because I was the person that was caught with my cell phone headset and my office headset, and nobody would tell me, and I look like a complete idiot.
Yeah.
Or
bond trader, one or the other.
Well, exactly. So what is your advice today? What is your recommendation?
Wow. I mean, I'm on the services side.
Yeah.
And the services side or the application side, not necessarily the guys who are selling the line access dial tone functionality, if you will.
Do people still need, I think that's my question. Do people really need the physical piece? I mean, I don't have one. I have this. That's all I have.
That's right. Yeah, that's where we all
are saying they still need to be hardwired. They still want data cabling throughout their space. Like,
really?
Why can't you use Wi-Fi and have a secure network? And they're like, oh no, we have to all be hardwired, and then they have to have their desktop phones. And I'm just thinking, is that really necessary based on all the angles of communication that we have Teams through our computers? Like,
it all depends. you know, I wish I could say here's the general rule, but in reality, just like in life, it all depends. So if you were in a highly secure arena, let's say financial services or anything along those lines, where the data has to be really protected, and there's an inner, a sancto sanctorum where the inner core has to be defended at multiple levels and at multiple depths, if you will, and functionalities. Sure, I can understand that. If if you're a small and medium business, let's say like a hair care salon, you really don't need that type of functionality, do you? Or if it's a car, a mechanic shop, something along those lines.
Something basic.
Exactly.
So we forward we have the lines and we just forward them to our cell phone. So we just have one phone.
Yeah.
And it seems like a simple solution. Really good question. I know we're asked a lot. What advice would you give a budding tech startup as they explore options to build their own proprietary technology? Like, you talk to startups. What is your advice when they kind of say, I don't even know where to start, or what would you recommend, knowing you've worked with a lot of different companies?
Know where to start. The reality is, okay, what's the value proposition that you're bringing to the table? And then I look at it in the context of, okay, so literally, what's your objective? What do you got today in terms of your capacity, capabilities, and some of that includes money.
Yeah.
I use a 6-factor analysis that, of all places, I learned when I was trained on how to run political campaigns. And the 6-factor analysis, 5 of them were from that and 1 is mine. And it goes as follows: time. How much time do you have? How much money do you have? How many people do you have involved? Time, money, people, will. What's the will? What's the objective? How, are you willing to go to the mat for this? Are you willing to change your life? Time, money, people, talent, will, technology. What are the technologies that you want to apply? And it's not an equal distribution. The reality is that, well, if you have, let's say, 40,000 people who are farmers who are living on a delta, and you want to build a monument for yourself, and you are willing to take those 40,000 people and put them to work almost as semi-slaves for 20 years, what do you got? You have the Great Pyramids of Egypt.
Yeah.
Or the Great Wall of China over the course of 100, 200, 300 years, all across that. Conversely, let's say you want to be president of the United States and the election is 18 months from now. Well, guess what? That's going to take a lot of money and a lot of talent to be able to accomplish that.
And a lot of relationships and string.
That's right. It is possible.
You have those.
Yeah, it is possible. But that's how, again, from the political perspective, that's if you've got that network and you have lots of, real people, meaning grassroots support, you may not need that money because you've got the grassroots support. If you don't have that grassroots support, you're going to have to spend a lot of money to develop that type of name recognition, et cetera. The same thing is applied into these environments, that you were talking about. Let's say you were a technology startup. I was in one where I got brought in by a VC, as I said earlier, who had a perspective offshore. Well, once I saw it, I'm like, the bottom line is that we go global from the start, and here's why. And then I made the rationale. Here's the strategy why we go global from the start. And guess what? It's going to cost money. Going to the board saying this is about $100,000 to $150,000 just in airfare alone for the right type of individual. And they were like, well, where'd you get this number? And I was like, well, I've done this before in a different context, but that's what it's going to take. We convinced them that this was a viable spend, or portion of the spend of the investment that they made. And as I said, 5 years later, that became a differentiating factor in our offer and in our inherent value, market value as a company, because our competitors, guess what? They were just domestic, focused on North America. And we were able to say, yeah, we have access to a little over 2.5 billion people across the globe because we have relationships with over 400 mobile network operators. And in the US, there were only about 8 or 10 that our competitors had. So we compounded that functionality and then compounded our valuation very, very quickly. So we were able to win out in the end. We were the ones with global domination as a motto. Literally, that was in my office once we started. People walk in, global domination, really? Yeah, that's what we're going to be doing here. So,
well, great stuff, Paul. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. This is great information you shared with everybody. And our goal with Evolve is to help professionals learn, connect, and grow together. And it was such a pleasure to speak with you.
Pleasure was all mine, Kim. Thanks again for the opportunity. I hope I didn't go on too long. So,
wonderful.
And thank you to the audience for listening. It was a great conversation with you.
You too.
Cheers. Bye-bye.